then it's really important that farmers do sell food crops. I mean, sell crops that can be eaten, food crops in that sense, because we need them to feed the cities, we need them in the cities. So this distinction, I said it's actually a colonial concept. It was used by colonial officers because they hadn't got any other way. They said, okay, you grow 1 acre of food crop and 1 acre of cash crop, or 1 acre of cassava, and then you can do what you like. You know, all sorts of basically government by simplistic directive, which goes back to colonial times. And we need to be cleverer than that now. That's not helpful. That's not a good way. It's not treating farmers as businesses or treating them seriously if you do that. Comparative advantage in production for food and export crops. International commodity prices are settled at high. Of course, the reason for the rise in the price of food is partly that America has taken huge areas of land for biofuels, but it's more because countries like China and India and other countries in Asia have got wealthier and also had ecological difficulties, and so they've become net importers where before they were net exporters. And that is not going to change quickly. That is their argument, that there's at least a 10 to 20 year period when there's likely to be worryingly high prices in terms of urban food prices for the urban populations around the world, because the prices will be high. Okay. And right, the first message from this report is that it's time for Tanzania to gear up to seize these great new food opportunities. Just so you get my reaction to that. Agriculture is not easy in Tanzania. It is in some places, but not in most. Famines, you know, when I wrote my book, I got into a few critical comments. And one of them was, Andrew, you haven't understood all the famines in pre-colonial Tanzania. You haven't understood them properly. There were some more famines that you missed out. This was from John Ireland. And I'm sure he's right. So famine there are famines in Tanzania. And there will be more. Global warming makes it more likely rather than less that there will be more. There will be unpredictability. The rains will fail in certain years. And I remember when I was here, when I put here the images of dead cows in the Sideland and dried up crops, maize especially. I mean, maize is a fickle crop. It's wonderful when its rains come at the right time, and nothing if they don't. And all that worrying as the rain is going to come. Even for people like me who don't depend on it, you know that a lot of people do. So there are cycles, and actually there are traditional drought-resistant crops, millet, sorghums are often mentioned, cassava. And of course, when the farmers think that there's going to be drought, then they will more plant those crops if they think they can get away with maize and slicing and which is good yield. Irrigation may or may not be a solution. So I think you can see where I'm coming from. And now let's just say a little bit about Kilimo Kwanza. I've learned more about it while I've been here this time than I had when I spoke in London. I think one of the things is it was actually formulated. It's interesting. I actually went to Sokoine. And where I learned most about Kilimo Kwanza was actually sitting in the bar of the hotel where I was at. And somebody came and I sat next to somebody. Spoke and asked this person what they were. And they were agricultural economists. Oh yes, and it was an agricultural economist who worked in Sokoine, it turned out. And then it turned out, he said, I'm one of the 7 authors of the first draft of Kilimo Kwanza. Gosh, I've met one of the authors of the first draft of Kilimo Kwanza. Well, it's not quite true. I mean, what actually seems to have happened was that the Agricultural Council of Tanzania wanted a political initiative in this and asked Sokoine to do it. And so 7 people got together, so they did send a draft to the Agricultural Council of Tanzania, National Tanzania Business Council. It got changed quite a lot after. So it's not that they wrote it, you can't say they wrote it, but they did start it off. And of course that's interesting because the people that promoted it were always in favour of large-scale farming. So there's always been a large-scale pressure group there which has fed off this rhetoric about Kilimo Kwanza. Because the other consequence of that way of starting was the Ministry of Agriculture got left out. It was a political, they saw it as a political initiative rather than an agricultural initiative. And I think that's one of the biggest issues that still arises. Now, if you actually take what is there, it's very hard to disagree with. I mean, if you take the 10 pillars, which you well know, I'm sure, if you take the implementation plan that spells out how they're to be delivered, there's only a few things that you would really disagree with. The problem with something like that is if you have a shopping list with basically, let's think of a shopping list with 100 items, but you only have enough money to buy a few, you choose the ones that you like, and you ignore the ones that you don't like. So what's happened is, because of the drafting was done by basically people who knew what they were doing from Sovereign, some of these other things have stayed there, but the emphasis is on the ones that we do. These are often the large scale ones. So we get it, so a lot of the cash is actually large scale. I'm not going to go through the 10 pillars, because they're all reasonable. Nobody could really disagree with anything there. The only one that you might disagree with, and Vince might have did nothing to throw out this presentation, is the fact of agricultural bank. Because agricultural banks have a counter, and that could just be a recipe for money going down the drain. You don't actually get them to take over if they don't survive. Farmers are very clever at not paying back loans to rural credits, and some other way of showing it. So that's why loans groups either linked to processing, so you more or less have to take your coffee to a certain place, or your cotton to a certain place. Not easy when vertical. That was one way of doing it, and it worked at times. Or where you can get a credit union type of organisation to police it, so the whole community becomes responsible for the loan, which is how PASS and some of the other local credit schemes are working. Okay, just going back to small farmers, these are the sort of things that they need. I don't want to stress those out. I think some of them are interesting. I think the use of mobile phones to get market information is potentially very valuable. They need inputs, they need seeds. Not much else. What they don't like, the obvious things. You don't have to tell them it's not rocket science. It's obvious, really. Don't like not being paid. No one knows anybody not being paid. They don't like middlemen who take a big cut. So there are big complaints about all the middlemen, big complaints about traders, big complaints about cooperatives. Because a cooperative sometimes is as bad as the traders. It's not just, you can't say a cooperative is always good. They don't like unofficial taxes, they don't like non-export bans or other non-market prohibitions, and they don't like not being able to get the things that they need. What do they do with their profit? All the things that poor people do with income. But they're important things, invest in better houses, school fees, basic services, better tools that actually coming back into the process. It's actually a very productive thing to do. Is it Kilimo or Mandalay Gabritigini? And Marjorie raised this very nicely in the workshop last year. Okay, women do more than half the work in agriculture. I don't think there should be a distinction between community development and agriculture in that sense. They're all things that involve the whole family. Livestock. When I worked in Kilimo, livestock was in the same ministry as crops. It's actually quite artificial to have it in a separate ministry. And that means if you have a cow on Kilimanjaro, that's in one ministry, and if you have some bananas, it's in another ministry. Or if you have a mixed farm, it's actually not. It's a danger that nobody owns it, and the livestock people become passionate about livestock. They don't necessarily see it as part of a contribution to an integrated farming system. But there are also important issues about land. And one of the risks at the moment is that the land which the pastoralists need to keep going, they need for the dry season grazing lands, get just converted into large farms. That would have serious implications for livestock. Seeds. the debate about GM seeds has become very heated and very important in East Africa. The starting point is you have Monsanto trying to basically control the whole world. It's a very brave, crazy, mad capitalist project. They're trying to capture the whole world market for seeds. They were actually doing that 30 years ago. There were Americans working in conventional agriculture trying to get a seed law that was modelled on American law that would allow them to patent seed varieties and generally control that process. The basic GM crop, in which a lot of the argument is based, is a particularly unpleasant crop, a particularly nasty thing, right? It's a crop that you can put the very strong weed killer called Roundup, made by this company Monsanto, on, and it will not affect the crop. It will kill everything else off except the crop. And of course, it's nice so the farmer has everything killed off, so except the crop. So you can see how it works. The trouble is that if you get the resistance spreads, as it is already doing in America, and it's more likely to do in Africa, you'll have resistant varieties of the genome, resistant varieties spreading through the seeds everywhere. But having said that, the ways that new seeds are produced are not working well. I mean, there were plant breeding programs in all the research stations 30 years ago. I don't think there are now. I can't get anyone to admit to them. But, I mean, there were composite varieties of maize produced in Kibiguru in Manchester, in Hungary, and they were very interesting because they were more drought resistant and they adapted to the environment. Of course, that was just done by breeding, that wasn't done by GM. Some of the other GM things I don't mind about so much. If people can build drought resistance in by GM, if people can build resistance to salt, so that you can plant rice on a more salty soil, that would be fine. I have no trouble with that. So I think that just a blanket opposition to GM is difficult to sustain. But the Roundup business in Monsanto, that is a worry to me. Research is, I've been trying to understand a bit how the research station network has developed in the period I've been away from it all. And I think it's not a happy situation. I mean, I think that so much of the research that goes on is donor dependent. So you get the donor that is doing something and they say, oh, support a research project. And that means the routine things don't get done. And the routine things involve such things as preserving the varieties of seed. Now you can refrigerate, there's all sorts of ways you can do it, but it requires an organisation, it requires continuity.